Hello and welcome back to the virtual classroom. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted. As you can see, we're in the second half of our lecture on the new industrial order. But as always, take a moment, hit pause on your screen, jot down the rest of the lecture outline, and pay particular attention to those key terms at the right. You got it? Let's get started. Now, we left off talking about all this new technology, these new processes, this new ideas of business to corporation, investment capital, etc. But what do these actually develop? And ultimately what we find is we see the rise of what we would call tycoons. They call themselves captains of industry, and as we'll discuss in our next couple lectures, they're known by another name, robber barons. But as businesses become larger, they often begin to consolidate and swallow up smaller businesses. There was fierce competition in each industry. And each industry would become dominated by one or a couple of giant tycoons or men. The businesses would grow both horizontally and vertically. So who are a couple of these? We're going to go through about 4 different major tycoons here. The first one we're going to talk about, example here, is of Andrew Carnegie. You cannot not talk about Andrew Carnegie, because he represents the epitome of both sides of our equation: captain of industry, robber baron. Now, Carnegie was the tycoon in steel. He was the captain of industry in the steel industry. So what about him? Well, he was actually a poor immigrant from Scotland. He immigrated from Scotland at age 12 with his parents in 1848. He came from a family of linen weavers. They made cloth. They were very poor. And by the 1830s, 1840s in Scotland, technology, machines, had replaced his family's livelihood making linen. And so his family decides to move to the United States, try to seek a better life for themselves. He finds a job as a clerk at a telegraph company, another one of those new technologies. And he starts out, very luckily for him, very fortunate, to work in technology industry. Well, during the war, he actually gets hired by the Pennsylvania Railroad. And it's during the war that he becomes the private secretary to the future president of the Pennsylvania Railroad, Thomas Scott. Now, in 1872, 1870s, he becomes very enthralled with the Bessemer process. In fact, he becomes such a prominent role in the railroad industry that he is tasked with the job of building a bridge for the Transcontinental Railroad across the Mississippi River. And no one can do it. But he's convinced, Carnegie is, that the future is steel. Remember, it supports 20 times its weight, it's lighter than iron. Iron bridges collapsed over the Mississippi. It's too wide, it's too heavy. When the train gets on there, it collapses, it can't be done. Carnegie is convinced that steel can get it done. Now, he goes way over budget, he goes way over his deadline, but he does it. He is the architect, the master builder that will complete the steel bridge across the Mississippi River. The fun story, fun aside, when the bridge was completed, no one would go on the bridge. They were afraid to. They were afraid that it would collapse. They just knew it would not last. And so Carnegie actually organized a parade. But at the front of his parade, the leader of the parade was an elephant. Yes, he hired an elephant. Why? There's an old wives' tale that said that elephants would not do something that would put their life in danger. Elephants were smart. And so Carnegie put the elephant at the front of the pack, the front of the parade, and the idea was if the elephant would cross the bridge willingly, the bridge was safe. If he wouldn't, well, Carnegie's in trouble. He's a failure. He's washed up. You never hear his name again. Of course, since you know his name, you know the elephant did cross the bridge, and as you can say, the rest is history. Because Carnegie left the railroad industry and began to open a steel mill. He realized steel was his future. and the future of the United States. And so in 1875, he opens his first steel mill, and over the next 25 years, he builds an empire. Now, he's a smart man. Give him credit where credit's due. He's smart. You see, he would take advantage of boom and bust cycles. Most people said, well, in a bust cycle, when the economy's down, you pull back, you rein in, you cut production, you tighten the purse strings, right? Carnegie didn't do that. During a bust cycle, when the economy was down, he spent money. He expanded. He bought out the competition. He did things to expand and increase production. Why? Because where everyone else was scared, he was bold. And he would buy equipment on the cheap. And then, of course, when the boom took place, he made bank. He was shrewd. He was smart. And he began to implement a very similar management system that the railroads used. And he figured out that, see, railroads were very one-sided, transportation. But he figured out steel, I can sell it to the railroads, I can sell it to industrial capitalists, I can sell it to cities, I can sell it to everyone. And so he opens his first steel mill in 1875, and he begins to grow and expand. And again, he's going to build his empire. In 1892, he will open his crown jewel in Homestead, Pennsylvania. And he centers his businesses right around the Pittsburgh area. Remember, Fort Pitt back with Fort Duquesne back in the day? Well, of course, Pittsburgh, you all know it today if you follow football, the Pittsburgh Steelers. They're called Steelers for a reason, because this is a steel town. Why is it important there? Well, there's oil in Pennsylvania for the machinery. We talked about that already in the last lecture. The Three Rivers area that all combine right there at Pittsburgh are vitally important for transportation and, of course, for fueling and cooling the factories, because steel's, remember, almost 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit. But we'll talk about Homestead later. Just know, in 25 years after his first, he will operate more than 2,000 steel mills. How does he create such a vast empire, though? How does he become one of the richest men in the world? And the answer is vertical integration. Carnegie said, why am I paying someone to get from the coal mine? Why am I paying the coal from the mine? Why am I paying them to mine the iron for me? Why am I paying someone else to ship it to me? Why am I paying someone else to, smelt it and use the best product? Why am I paying someone else to actually produce the final product? He said, no. I want to own it all. And so he actually would own the mine. He would own the limestone quarry. He would own the iron mine. He would own the shipping facility. He would own the steel mill, and finally the actual manufacturer that would make the finalized product of steel, the beam, the rail, whatever it was. This is called vertical integration because he controls every step in the production process. He even built some of his steel mills right on top of the railroad tracks, literally over the railroad tracks, so that when the train brought the iron in, they would have to drive through his steel mill, which made it more efficient for unloading. Again, he's a smart man. Carnegie controlled every part of the process. In 1900, his company alone produced more steel than Great Britain. And he profited, not how much he took in, but how much profit he made after expenses. $40 million in 1900 money. Yeah, billions now. Now, what Carnegie was to steel, John D. Rockefeller was to oil. John D. Rockefeller is a very different story, because whereas Carnegie was the American dream, right? A poor immigrant coming over to become a millionaire, self-made millionaire, right? John D. Rockefeller was not that. John D. Rockefeller had worked in finance. He was educated in finance from New York. But in 1870, he formed a company known as Standard Oil in Ohio. And he was a ruthless competitor. What he would do was he would buy out competitor companies. So if you had an oil business just down the road from him, he would seek to buy you out. Now, if you refused, he would use what's called predatory pricing. Now, predatory pricing is basically you sell your product below cost, which means you're taking a loss on it. So if your product costs $10 to sell or to produce, you sell it for $7 or $5. Now, are you losing money? Yes. But is anyone going to buy from your competitor down the road? Well, no, they're going to buy it from you. Because your competitor down the road is not as big as you. They can't afford to sell their product below cost. Or if they do, they can't do it as long as you can. And when they falter or declare bankruptcy, they will either sell it to you cheaply or declare bankruptcy and you get to buy them out that way. Either way, you are able to control the market. Now, predatory pricing is still practiced today. In the late 1990s, Microsoft did this. They used predatory pricing to ensure that every computer would use Microsoft Windows. If you think about it, how many operating systems are there really? I mean, Google's pretty new at this. But for most of the last 40 years, there's only Apple OS, which was a fairly small chunk of the vast market. It really is, despite Apple being such a big company. Microsoft controls the vast majority of the marketplace because they used predatory pricing in the 90s to run out every other business that produced software and operating systems for computers. Back to Rockefeller. He would use this position to demand cheaper, better prices from transportation networks like railroads. So not only is he able to use predatory pricing, he's able to undercut competitors by having cheaper rates on the railroad. He's ruthless. To the point where by 1890, within 20 years, Standard Oil, John D. Rockefeller, controls 90% of the oil industry. Now, there's a fancy name for this also. When you start buying out all your competition and control the competition, this is called horizontal integration. So whereas Carnegie had vertical, control every step of the process, Rockefeller goes outward, horizontally controls all the competition. He just bought them out or ran them out of business through predatory pricing. But Rockefeller had a problem. You see, he wanted to be bigger. But he had a problem as the state of Ohio only allowed him to own plants in the state of Ohio. You were not allowed, as a corporation, to own across state lines according to Ohio law. This severely limited his empire. But don't worry, he will find a way, just like people always do. By the way, you want a modern example of horizontal integration? I'm glad you asked. Yeah, Disney. You buy out the competition. They bought Star Wars, Marvel, Pixar, 20th Century Fox. This is now, are there other studios? Of course there are. But there's no doubt that this is horizontal integration, trying to buy out your competition. So how does Rockefeller, though, become so big? How does he get around the Ohio laws? Well, he pioneered a new form of corporate structure known as a trust. So what is a trust? Well, a trust is a way to A, find a loophole in Ohio law to own across state lines, and B, to create a monopoly. So basically what happens is your shareholders, the shareholders of your corporation surrender all their shares in trust. In other words, they give up control, their direct interest, their direct control, and instead place the control in the hands of a trust. They place their control in trust of a central board of directors. They have the power to control all property. Now, if you watch a lot of movies, which I have in my life, I love movies, You always see in business movies where the board has voted out the original owner, and usually that creates a villain somehow. If you watch the original Spider-Man movies, Norman Osborn was the owner of Oscorp, right? He's the founder, he's the leader of it, and the board votes him out, says he's incompetent, and of course then he turns into a supervillain, right? The board overruled the owner because the board has the ultimate control. Why is this important? Well, all the shareholders place their shares in trust to this board. And even though theoretically they're still an owner, Norman Osborn in this case, John D. Rockefeller, the reality is no one technically owns the business, even though in this case, Rockefeller is still squarely in charge. So because the trust does not literally own other companies, they're able to circumvent Ohio law, and no law is technically violated. Standard Oil formed the first trust in 1882, which allows Rockefeller to control, again, basically the entire oil industry, 90% of it at least. And trusts will soon become the model for other corporations, leading to monopolies. These trusts are ruthless. They stifle and crush competition. They control prices for entire industry. They price fix. This is big business at its highest and most ruthless. A couple more I'm going to talk about, though. Next on our list is J. Piermont Morgan. Now, this is a name you probably should recognize. Now, J. Piermont Morgan, after the Civil War, he had taken control of his father's investment bank. Yes, he was again, wealthy already, but he took control of his father's investment bank. And the House of Morgan would play a central role in consolidating industries. Remember, they need investment capital. We talked about that earlier, right? And he's able to loan when Rockefeller needs a loan to go and buy out competition, he goes to J. Piermont Morgan. When Carnegie wants to start a new steel mill, he goes to J. Piermont Morgan. In 1893, we had a panic of 1893 in our country, and we went through a severe recession to the point where the U.S. government was almost in default of its loans. Guess who bailed out the U.S. government? J. Piermont Morgan. Now, if you don't know who he is yet, I'm sure you really do. He goes by the name J.P. Morgan. And of course, he's the founder of Chase Bank. Yeah, that J.P. Morgan, Chase Bank. Still around today. Now, as much as I tout Carnegie as being a wealthy man, he pales in comparison to J.P. Morgan. Because J.P. Morgan bailed out the U.S. government. And then, in 1901, J.P. Morgan called his good friend Andrew Carnegie and said, "Hey, Andy, you want to sell me your steel mill, Carnegie Steel, your entire steel business, 2,000 steel mills?" And Carnegie's like, "No." And J.P. Morgan's like, no, seriously. Carnegie's like, "No, you can't afford me. I'm not selling. I don't want to sell." And J.P. Morgan's like, no, give me a number. Now, remember, I told you he netted $40 million, right? In 1900. So 1901, J.P. Morgan comes to him and says, "Hey, put a price tag on your business." And Carnegie says, "Okay, let me think about this. I'll tell you what. You give me $400 million and I'll sell you my business." J.P. Morgan said, "You want cash or check?" And bought Carnegie Steel. He will merge it with other steel mills and will form a conglomerate known as U.S. Steel Corporation that will produce 2/3 of all American steel. And by 1910, by the time it's all consolidated, U.S. Steel will be worth $1.4 billion in 1910 money. It is the United States' first billion-dollar corporation that's worth more than the national debt. Yeah, it's that big of a deal. Now, one more man to talk about, and that is Cornelius Vanderbilt, otherwise known as Commodore Vanderbilt. Now, in railroads, the leader of it, there's more than one leader, obviously, but one of the most famous ones is Cornelius Vanderbilt. Now, he started in shipping, and he sold all of his ships, which is why he actually got nicknamed the Commodore, because he had a fleet of ships. But he would be the one to really push railroads forward. And he saw that ships were out, boats, and went to trains instead. And if you think about it, there's a whole university named for him, Vanderbilt University in Tennessee. Their nickname is the Commodores, and their mascot is, in fact, a locomotive, hence trains. You see the map he has there, but more importantly to him was what he does. Because he's invited by the Mexican president, Santa Anna, and later on Porfirio Diaz. He's invited by Porfirio Diaz into Mexico to help develop the Mexican rail lines. Now, Porfirio Diaz wanted Vanderbilt to connect the railroads east and west to connect the country. Not Cornelius Vanderbilt. Vanderbilt had the lines built north and south to connect the heartland rural areas of Mexico and Mexico City to the United States to be able to extract resources from Mexico, both people and natural resources. Then there's one of his right-hand men. You see a person in the bottom right named by the name of William Walker. William Walker was hired and paid by Cornelius Vanderbilt to overthrow Sonora, Mexico. And while that did not technically happen, he was able, by this mission to do so, was able to convince the U.S. government and the Mexican government to negotiate the purchase of the Gadsden Purchase, which is, where that area is at. This is that southern area of New Mexico and Arizona. So a strip of land known as the Gadsden Purchase. It was William Walker, hired by Cornelius Vanderbilt, that convinced the two nations, Mexico and the United States, to negotiate the Gadsden Purchase to give us more land in the United States. While Walker did fail to take Sonora, and in the end, Vanderbilt didn't even build a railroad there, the Gadsden Purchase went through, expanding the idea of U.S. power and corporate influence in government decision-making. This idea of a tycoon, an oligarch, becomes power is very reminiscent, if you took the first half of U.S. history, about how slave state ideas and how these senators from slave states controlled politics that influenced the outcome of the Mexican-American War, that helped dictate our borders. Oh, just for one more fun story about William Walker. He also was hired later on to go into Nicaragua and try to overthrow Nicaragua because Vanderbilt wanted to build a canal there to make shipping easier. Walker did succeed, but he turned his back on Vanderbilt and tried to re-enslave Nicaraguans for himself, and eventually they killed William Walker for it. So Vanderbilt had not only national aspirations of railroads, but he had international aspirations, hiring William Walker to take over Sonora, which failed, then to take over Nicaragua to build a canal, which succeeded, but then William Walker turns back on Vanderbilt, and ultimately Walker will be killed by Nicaraguans. But Vanderbilt and Walker are this example of Latin American manifest destiny. That we believe our manifest destiny should expand beyond going to the Pacific Ocean, but rather going south into Latin America and extract their resources. It's an example of the power of business. And it sets up a precedent for the very poor future U.S.-Nicaraguan relations that will exist almost to the present day in places all throughout Central America. Now, before we get to all the other issues here, it's our next lecture's focus. There's no doubt these men were successful in the context of building wealth and industrializing our country. Again, railroads, oil, investment capital, steel, all very important. But American corporations became oppressive systems. There were no laws that regulated monopolies, no laws to regulate wages or working conditions. But these men, these tycoons of industry, these captains of industry, justified it by stressing that opportunity and economic growth were vital. And they created this growth and economic opportunity. They stressed that anyone could be Andrew Carnegie. Anyone could be a self-made man, immigrant, poor immigrant coming over here from Scotland and become a billionaire. Now, was this the truth? No, of course not. But these defenders of big business blamed the individual for not getting rich. In other words, these men all made it because they were smart and ruthless and driven. But other than Carnegie, who was an immigrant, poor immigrant, Vanderbilt had wealth from his father. J.P. Morgan was an investment banker from his father. Rockefeller came from money from his father. They all started out ahead in life. The reality is most could not become an Andrew Carnegie. But they touted this idea and said, no. The reason you did not become Andrew Carnegie is because you are lazy. You are ignorant. You are morally depraved. It's your fault you do not become Andrew Carnegie. And this became known as social Darwinism. They took the ideas of Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, survival of the fittest, and applied it to social situations, applied it to society, and said, no. Only the fittest in society will succeed. And therefore, if you don't succeed, it's because you're not socially fit enough, which means you have a problem. It's your fault. You could become Andrew Carnegie if you would just work harder, stop being lazy, and you were not so morally depraved, and you were not so ignorant. Go get an education. Go get a skill. Become morally excellent. Which the reality is it's very hard to do when you're being forced to work in these sweatshops, in these very poorly run, poorly defined, low wages, long hours, poor work conditions. But that is something for the next lecture. For now, though, and the big thing here was government did nothing to prevent this for the most part. There were no laws to protect workers, only to prevent or to protect the owners. Now, there was one push, one time, in the 19th century to bring some control to these corporations. It became known as the Sherman Antitrust Act. And basically it said that it outlawed, quote, every contract, combination in the form of trust or otherwise, or conspiracy in restraint of trade or commerce, unquote. What does that mean? Well, theoretically, it means you can't have monopolies, you can't use trusts to prevent competition. That's what it means theoretically. But it's very vaguely written. And the U.S. Supreme Court in 1895 would gut it and say, no, you are not allowed to use and break up monopolies or break up businesses, corporations, for manufacturers. And therefore, this law, this act is essentially gutted. Because they said, no, government can't step in and regulate private corporations, private manufacturers. And so therefore, the government did very little to curtail this. So the only real push early on was some cartoons to highlight these issues. Number one, of course, is these fat cats in the back. You see them here. The Steel Beam Trust, the Copper Trust, Standard Oil Trust, the Iron Trust, Sugar Trust, all of them standing in back over top of the Senate. Again, you see the implications. Some senators looking back at them saying, well, how should I vote? Remember, J.P. Morgan bailed out the government. Who do you think has real control here? It's the money. Of course, we have the king here of Standard Oil, John D. Rockefeller, who controls so much. And again, Standard Oil, as his octopus arms extend everywhere. Remember, he controlled 90% of the market, including his tentacle wrapped around the White House, because again, they became oligarchs. These captains of industry became oligarchs that had so much influence on politics that no laws could be passed against them. And this becomes a problem because they become too big for the government. They become a big problem for the American people. But that, however, is a topic of our next lecture. So until then, take care and bye-bye.